Hey guys, welcome back to a Study in Truth podcast. Join Ethan and me today as we talk about evil, pain, and suffering. So today we're talking about evil, pain, and suffering. I've got Ethan Tate with me here today. Ethan is the Dean of Media, correct? At the Tri-City School of Preaching. He's one of the instructors. Also preaches at the Rogersville Church of Christ. How long have you been there?
I've been there 4 years this month.
Nice.
Is fourth year.
4 years too long. No, I'm just kidding. Well, that's awesome. He's an excellent servant in the kingdom, a good friend of mine. And you should be hearing. You should be hearing Bill Haywood, another member of the school here, in another episode, hopefully, Lord willing. But today we're talking about the subject of evil, pain, and suffering because it's a really important subject. A lot of people doubt God because of this. And before we get into it, I do want to try to be empathetic to people. I've never really experienced anything really bad in my life. I can safely say my life has been pretty good, especially when I compare it to others. A lot of people doubt God's existence because, well, I see all the evil in the world and therefore there's no God. And that's one thing. But when someone actually experiences this stuff, firsthand, I try to be more empathetic with that. So, in this episode and hopefully another episode we'll do after this, we are trying to be empathetic because this is a sensitive subject and we're not expecting someone just to listen to this, pull over and jump in the water and get baptized, So, we want to try to be understanding. And so in the first part today, we're going to talk about just the fact that just because there's evil, pain, and suffering, that doesn't negate God's existence. We're going to look at the argument that is given a lot of times from people, and we'll have an answer for that in a sense of why those arguments aren't good. And then we'll look at a dilemma to denying God's existence when there is evil, pain, and suffering. And then hopefully in the next episode, we'll actually get more applicable to this, talk about why there's suffering and the hope that we can find in Christ because of it. So let's start off with the old Epicurean argument. First of all, the Bible claims three things about God. It claims that he is all-powerful. Genesis chapter 17 and verse 1 is one reference where God tells Abraham, I am Almighty God. He's claiming he is all-powerful. It also says that he is all-loving. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 8 refers that God is love. It's basically telling us that God defines what love is, and so the implication is he's all-loving. And then finally it says that he's all-knowing. God knows everything. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 20 tells us, for if our heart condemns us, God is greater than our heart and knows all things. So this is what the Bible claims. We believe that, but people seem to have this problem with these three aspects of his nature. And again, it is understandable. It's not true, but there are some, could I say valid, there's a valid understanding to this. I can see why people get this because this is a tough subject. But basically what it is, here's the argument. If evil, pain, and suffering exists, then at least one of these attributes of God is deficient. God is lacking in something in his nature. Now, we'll talk more about God's nature in the second episode, hopefully. But I just want to start off with why this argument isn't really good. It's valid. There's some validity behind it, but it's not true. There is some error to it. The first argument is that if God is all loving, then that means that if he's all, let me start over. God is all powerful, all knowing, but he doesn't love us enough to stop the suffering. And thus that makes God evil. Ethan, what would you say the problem with that is? If he's all powerful and all knowing, then, but he must not love us enough to stop all the suffering.
So from the person making this claim, they're basically seeing a deficiency in God if he's really ultimately powerful and all-knowing. So we would call that omniscient and omnipotent, but he's not um, omni-loving, if you want to use that phrase, omni-gracious, then that kind of presents God lacking, is what this appears. And I mean, you can interchange any three of these. Like you can put love back in the equation and take out all knowing. If he's all powerful and all loving, then he must not be all knowing. Otherwise, this wouldn't happen. Or if he's all loving and all knowing, then he's not all powerful to stop it. So they're really trying to see a deficiency that they presume exists in God. But really, that presents an even greater question with this, which I guess we'll deal with here in a little bit, of what is God in light of suffering? Like, how does he resonate with it? I mean, obviously, he's everlasting. So I wonder if even the people who make this argument really understand the character of God and what are the causes of evil, pain, and suffering. Is God the cause of it? Is he still the cause if he allows it? Or is it something that goes against his will, but free moral agency plays a factor into this?
That's good. That's a good question. There's more questions that follow up with that.
Oh, yes.
And I like that. So yeah, we'll talk more about the nature of God, because I think these claims do come from an ignorance, and I say that nicely. I don't mean that in any insulting kind of way, but it comes from an ignorance of God's nature and who he is, and again, why there is suffering.
That's right. And where those three questions come, the Epicurean problem is what they call it. You're looking at a man who lived in the 4th and 3rd century BC, who formed those questions that people are still using as kind of like the philosophical basis to argue this question from. So this isn't something that's brand new. If you're just hearing it, it might be brand new to you if you're listening. But it's not a brand new argument. So, and I mean, you can look all the way back in Genesis 3 and following, you're going to find there is suffering that takes place because sin begins to enter the equation. But then that's going to go more into the answer of how do we work through examining suffering.
And as Solomon wrote, there's nothing new under the sun, and Epicurus proves that. This is an old argument. He says it in a longer way. And I just wanted to sum it all up, but
it's got about 12 chapters.
Yeah. If you want to go look it up just for your, get you a pot of coffee or two and read it. So let's talk about the first one. You know, a lot of atheists, skeptics, agnostics, they'll say that God doesn't love us enough to stop the suffering, and therefore he would be evil. But there's a problem in that of itself. And again, I say this all nicely, if you're an atheist, you can't really grasp at a law system that's objective or higher than you or me and say that God's evil. If there's no God, there's no ultimate place like heaven or hell. If there's no moral law system above us, and if you want to know more about that, go back to the first episode where me and Mitchell talk about that. But if there's no God, there is no absolute law system. We can't philosophically or logically call God evil then, right?
Otherwise, we're making philosophy the God that's determining that outcome.
Yeah.
Or we're making ourselves God to be able to make that kind of claim of someone that the Bible would reveal is, I mean, all compassionate and all knowing. So this is going to present a lot of problems.
Yeah. And I mean, from atheism, Charles Darwin, I think, says it best that a man who has no assured or ever present belief in the existence of a personal God or of a future existence with retribution and reward can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, that was the problem, he only looked as far as he could see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are strongest or which seem to him the best ones. So that means if there is no God, then there are no absolutes or objective morals. Then you can't look at God and say, well, you're evil. At best, you're calling God evil just based on your opinion. I mean, that's the best that you can do. God, you can't say God is objectively or absolutely evil. And, you know, if I was talking to an atheist, I may ask them questions like, well, if God is evil, does that make, where does truth come from? Where does morality come from? You know, who calls the shots on what's evil and what's good? And you may have some decent answers out there, but none of them are going to stand up with logic. So we'll talk a little bit more about why God's not evil the cause of the evil pain and suffering that does occur.
Well, even going along with Charles Darwin's comment, multiple times throughout the scriptures, it always makes reference to like the limitation of man's insight. And I would encourage those who are listening, I would read through Job 33. Now, you don't necessarily need to believe in the Bible to read Job 33, but there's a lot of pre-context that flows into what's going on. Job obviously is the book of like ultimate decimation and suffering. And I mean, it even talks about in the book of James towards the end, in chapter 5, look at the patience of Job and see the long suffering and the compassion that God has in store for those who endure through suffering. But that still doesn't answer like what started that to begin with. But anyways, in chapter 33, there's a young man there who has been listening to the arguments of Job's three friends, because all that happens in the first two chapters. Three of Job's friends come to Job. But then there's this fourth person that the text never tells us when, this young guy named Elihu. That's a popular English name, if you haven't noticed. He begins to defend what they have said either against God or what Job may have said against God. And he's not necessarily saying that he knows everything about God. In fact, what Elihu does say is, look, I don't know everything, but that's not the God that has revealed himself to us. So in chapter 33, what makes this chapter really unique is that if you want to get an insight from a otherworldly perspective, Elihu gives us a little bit of vision into what God is doing or how God helps man through life. And it would say in verse number 14, for God may speak in one way or in another, yet man does not perceive it. That's what Charles Darwin was basically saying. He's looking at what he can visibly see on the surface and presuming that he has all the information, which is where a lot of the problem begins with. Limited information will give you a limited answer.
Sure.
Now, from your perspective, that might be all the information available to you, thus you're giving an answer based on all the information. But that doesn't mean that it's all the information. So what Charles Darwin is saying is exactly what people who are asking the simple question, why am I going through this? They're trying to grasp through the pain, and God does notice that, but we'll talk about how he works through that in a little bit.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, again, like he said, you may not believe the Bible, but you will understand some of this by reading the Bible, and it'll make more sense. And these are real people that went through things that wrote this. So yeah, we'll talk more about that. And I want to bring up Genesis or Acts 17 about the nature of God, which I'll bring up later about understanding God's nature. It's like, oh, I want to get into that now.
There's a lot of stuff. Yes.
So the other argument is, okay, maybe God's all powerful. Maybe he's all loving, but maybe it's the case he just doesn't know about all of it. You know, if all of this is happening, maybe coworker is bullying me or I'm going through this cancer or something. And, you know, God's powerful enough. He loves me, but maybe he just doesn't know what's going on. He's just kind of forgetful, it seems like. And that's, you know, I kind of understand why people think that, but people need to understand this, that God does know everything. Now, that doesn't mean that he's not going to do anything about it. That doesn't mean that he doesn't love us. And there's a reason why he doesn't act when we do suffer, but he does know everything. In fact, Psalm 139 literally tells us the Bible's not going to shy away from it. It's going to come right out and tell us, I know when you're suffering. I know it's happening. God's not going to just deny this. In Psalm 139, let me get there. David it's a beautiful psalm, probably one of my favorite ones. And he tells us in, verse number 7, where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. Go down to verse number 9. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest parts of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. If I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and the light around me will be night. Even the darkness is not dark to you, and the night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light are alike. And so what David is telling us is God is aware when I'm going through good times. He's there when I'm going through bad times. God knows literally everything. So to say, well, he just doesn't know about it. Well, he does. Now that doesn't answer the question. Well, then why is he not acting? Why is he not helping me? But it does tell us he does know. And we'll get to why he doesn't always act in just a moment. And again, we can't answer literally everything for God other than what we have in the scripture. But the third one is, okay, maybe he's all loving, maybe he's all knowing, but what if it's the case he's just not powerful enough to prevent evil, pain, and suffering from happening? Maybe he's just weakened or something. And again, what we're about to say right now doesn't answer why he doesn't prevent all suffering, but the Bible shows us over and over again, he is powerful enough. Right now, if you're going through something really tough, God is at this moment powerful enough to prevent that or to maybe let it happen and then take it away from you. But that doesn't necessarily explain, why is he not acting now? For example, I've got 2 Kings 19, probably one of my favorite chapters of God's power. And you might think, well, this isn't God doing this literally, but it has an angel coming down from heaven, wiping out 185,000 Assyrians. And you're like, well, that's not God. I think that still shows how powerful God is, because if one angel can do that, what can he do?
Well, is an angel allowed to do something? Well, I can already see a rebuttal of this question. Can an angel go ahead and do something who belongs to God, follows God, serves God? Can they do something on behalf of God that God did not authorize? Mm-hmm. So that angel would have to be one who was sent by God to do this.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not an angel of the Lord.
For sure, yeah. And that just shows God's so powerful, he doesn't even need to come down and do that to the Assyrians. I'll just send one of my angels to do that. That's easy. So that's just one example. You can go through the Exodus account. You can go through turning water into wine. You can go through all the things that God shows his power. He is powerful enough. Now, the answers that we find in the Bible as to why he doesn't act and prevent things, I think makes sense to me. It may not make sense to anyone listening, but there are answers. And I think when we really look at it, there is comfort to it. There is hope when we find it. Oh, well, that makes sense. I don't like this right now, but that does make sense. But I want to show now, before we jump into episode 2 eventually, is the solutions that atheism has for evil, pain, and suffering. And again, I wished we could spend a long time on the why those arguments are bad, but it just would take too long. If you're an atheist, Ethan, what solution would you have for evil, pain, and suffering?
Well, I would probably throw out there to begin with. So normally, if I were an atheist, or if I were talking to an atheist, my first plea to anyone religious-minded or spiritual-minded or otherworldly feeling, or feeling meta, be open-minded. Mm-hmm. Be open-minded. Now, what people mean by that is accept my viewpoint and don't say anything against it. Mm-hmm. Well, that's kind of open-mindedness. Open-mindedness is simply being willing to listen to information. You don't necessarily need to accept that information based off your choice. That's the free moral agency aspect. But we would encourage more than just open-mindedness. Why not fair-minded in light of the evidence being presented? And not saying that like everything presented here is the answer. That's like you've been saying so far, Luke. It's like, you're dealing with a huge thought and a huge issue that, you've got people like where I'm the minister at. We have one sister who's an older lady, and she has 3 daughters. Mm-hmm. One of which actually died at a very, very young age through a very horrible car accident. Mm-hmm. And in light of what she had went through, I don't mean it this way when I say it this way, but she had problems overcoming and getting over that. And by
Mhm.
getting over, I'm not meaning that in any kind of disrespectful way, but like, how do you work through that? Or like,
Mhm.
do we expect people to let go of pain? No, because sometimes pain can be a motivator. If
Yeah.
you don't want to lose in a race, the pain or the thought of losing might actually motivate you to win the
Sure.
race. Well, how's that correlate with like trying to associate that with pain and losing life?
Mhm.
Well, that's a different matter, because now we're talking about someone has lost possession of their physical vehicle, and now we're talking about a spiritual aspect. So now there's more questions. Where does their spirit go, my loved one, when they die? So with the atheist, what I would ask is, even though we don't have time to list every option, be open minded, be fair minded with the evidence, and also be humble and honest enough with yourself to look through the evidence.
Mhm.
Just because we say it doesn't make it right.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's many times um, in using the word evil, um, we could look at evil like Adolf Hitler and what he did in World War II. We could look at evil like a Volunteer fan versus Alabama football season. They are evil.
That's a sensitive subject.
It could be like cats and dogs with their natural not liking one another, which really, that I think that's not necessarily true. They just got to get used to one another. Then again, some cats just are really, really biased.
They are.
So like being unbiased with the information, that's really going to help anyone, whether or not you believe in God or not, really looking at the evidence. And what I'm not asking you to do is be so logical with this that you end up losing truth.
Yeah.
Like there's got to be like reason and rationale. That's got to be able to work with how life functions. So like I think it would be important to really take into consideration, you mentioned Ecclesiastes 3, how life simply is what Ecclesiastes 3 talks about. And note, as I read through at least the beginning portion of this, note how many things we would consider, well, that's evil, that's suffering, because it's all through here. But
Yeah.
it implies that this is a part of the natural life process. So am I not wanting something that's natural? Listen to what it would say beginning in verse 1. To everything there is a season. So all my joys, my laughs, there's the opposite. A time to be born, a time to die. That's negative. A time to plant, and a time to pluck what is planted. Now that could go one of two ways. Either pluck it up because it's died, or pluck it up because it's ready for harvest. So that could imply a negative. A time to kill. I'm not thinking that means murder, but there's a time to stop. A time to heal, a time to break down, a time to build up. Verse 4 is really key. A time to weep. This is simply crying. You are very sad. A time to laugh, a time to mourn. This is when the air is knocked out of you. You are down on your knees. You cannot breathe and you can't think. There are emotions flooding your body and you feel your face flushing and blushing with heat. This is a uncontrollable sobbing. So there are times where you will uncontrollably sob, but notice the counter. A time to laugh, a time to dance, a time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones, a time to embrace, a time to refrain from embracing, a time to gain and a time to lose, a time to keep, a time to throw away, time to tear, a time to sow, time to keep silent, and a time to speak, a time to love, a time to hate, a time of war, and a time of peace. Now, there are a lot of things in here that some people may not agree with, but what this text is simply saying is that everything is going to happen. In fact, what's really weird is when you look at verse 11 in how God has made the world. God has made, now this seems counterintuitive to what we're trying to do, but God has made everything beautiful in its time. how do I find beauty in suffering? How do I find beauty in death?
Yeah.
And that kind of goes back to how God sympathizes and empathizes, and he cares and he hears us when we cry out to him. There are things in life that are uncomfortable. Look at the life of Jesus. Obviously, he died a horrible death. He got an amazing exaltation afterwards, but it was a horrible death.
Yeah.
But I find it weird. You don't read about Joseph after his childhood, so it might imply Joseph died or something happened between Joseph and Mary. We don't know.
Yeah.
I would think Joseph was a just man because that's what the Bible would call him. What about the relatives, Elizabeth, Zechariah? What about John the Baptist? After he died, it just said Jesus went away into a distant land. What about when Lazarus died? And we find John 11, Jesus wept. Jesus experienced that. Well, if Jesus experienced that and he's the Son of God, he's part of the Godhead, then the Father, God, he would be able to resonate with that as well, being that he made all of us. So this is a long explanation. How should the atheists work with this? I've got to look at this in the way that life has been structured. And if I'm trying to restructure the reality of this world, then I've suddenly become closed-minded to the reality of how everything works. So be realistic, be rational, weigh the evidence, but also be humble and honest enough to wherever the evidence is leading, that's the answer.
That's good. And this leads perfectly into this point, is that if there is no God, the implication is there's no heaven and there's no hell. And if all of that is true, and all of this suffering's going on, like for instance, let's say the woman that you mentioned whose children died in a car wreck, is that what you said?
One of her children died.
Okay, I don't know exactly what happened. Let's assume, or let's pretend, be hypothetical, that how that child died was because of a drunk driver. And maybe that happened, maybe it didn't. We do know that stuff happens. So like, if you're going through that, let's say you're the mother, if there's no God, the drunk driver, let's say he lives, he sobers up and he has a great life after that, lives to 100 years old, dies peacefully, but he never repented of that. He never changed. He was not sorry for it. There's not any judgment on him. So like that, there's no solution there to the evil that was done to your daughter by that man. You don't have a judge of all the earth. And now that doesn't, as an atheist, you're like, well, you can't prove there's a judgment. Well, I know that. I'm just looking at this for just a moment from just an emotional. Well, I'll talk about this in just a minute. Everybody wants justice. All of us want justice. We'll talk about that in episode 2 more. You don't get any justice. Let's say the man just goes on and brags how he did that to your daughter. Well, he's not going to be judged if there's no God. So there's no solution for evil. And then there's no solution for pain and suffering. So like, I know a guy who, he's my age. He, I think, was in a car accident at 3 or 4 years old. I don't remember when it happened, but I remember seeing him afterwards, and he was in a vegetable state. I think he died pretty recently. And I think he could understand what people said to him, but he couldn't. He was in discomfort all the time. He was just in a very miserable existence. What solution would you give them? I mean, all you could tell them really is, well, that's just the way life is. That's just how it goes. That's it, And I know that doesn't really answer anything necessarily, but it just shows that that's a problem. There's no solution. You don't run away from God, because if you run away from God in spite of evil, pain, and suffering, it's only going to get darker. It's only going to get worse.
And I think it's worthy to know as well. I'm going to keep referencing Job, both in this episode and the next one, because that book specifically works well with looking at why we suffer, why there's pain, why is there evil in the world. And in fact, the friends of Job actually use a lot of arguments that people would use in light of, well, maybe it's because you sinned and you've not repented, or maybe it's because you've not been righteous enough towards God, or, it's just God's will that they die, which that's a terrible answer. You're not going to be able to prove that either way. So like, how are you getting that info? So I say that to say every situation is going to be different. Not saying that God allowing suffering, that it's always going to be the same reason or the same background. Like in the case of if a drunk driver hits a woman, did God cause that man to drink himself, to get drunk? Wouldn't that have been the parents' fault because you have a guy who wasn't trained right? Or maybe it was his fault because he failed to control himself. Or maybe it was the sales clerk fault. Maybe it was an underage kid and he had a false license, and
Sure.
he should have caught that, and this would have happened. And somehow it all gets pointed back to God because he could have saw all this take place, which is part of the answer to this. So, like, there's not a one size fits all for every situation. And in fact, there in Job, there's not a specific answer as to why people suffer. And the Bible even explains that as well. But what it does talk about is how we can work through our suffering and how we can find answers to motivate us to be better. So,
Yeah.
And I don't even know, when we're looking at the problem of pain, evil, and suffering, is suffering, evil, and pain really the right word to describe what we're feeling negative feelings towards? Discomfort, yes, definitely. Unfortunate, most definitely. Otherwise, this wouldn't be a problem. But I think it's important for us to notice, okay, what points did people in the past make about pain? And then what does God say about pain and how we work through pain? So, I mean, the terms, we can run through a lot of scenarios,
Yeah.
but I mean, it's ultimately going to rely on, it's like, what does God actually say is going to help guide us through these issues?
Sure. Yeah. And it would, like, these issues we're talking about and the answers we have, it would be different for me if I was going through something hard right now. And I don't mean hard as in like, like I failed a math test, it's like, get over that. But I'm talking about real suffering, real pain, we are here to tell you, if you're listening, and maybe you're going through something, you're doubting something. First of all, we're sorry, that's happening. But second of all, the Bible does offer a solution. It may not be a giddy solution. It's not this, oh, that's great, I feel good now, it's gone, there's no sorrow. No, there's the sorrow still there, the mourning's still there. That Solomon wrote, the time to weep, the time to mourn, that's still going to be there. But the Bible does offer a solution nevertheless. Mm-hmm. There is something that's coming. And as Hebrews 12 says, Jesus had this joy set before him. He had a joy, I guess, maybe in that moment, but it was more of what was set before him, of what was coming.
Even has that little clause in there. It's like despising the cross.
He hated it. Yeah, like he hated it. And so that's what the Bible does for us. It gives us something that's going to come in the future. It may come in this lifetime, but it's definitely going to come in the next, as far as what we have in the cross and in the resurrection. So we'll talk more about that in episode number 2. But don't run away from God is what we're saying ultimately, because if you do, you're, as Friedrich Nietzsche found, nihilism. It's just miserable. It's nothing. If all we have in this life is Christ, and it's only in this life, as Paul says, we're just miserable.
And I would add to that, maybe you're just rejecting the idea of God. Don't run away from the possibility of God.
Yeah.
Because if you rule out what actually is the answer, then you're never going to find an answer, and you're just going to keep going down a rabbit hole of loose ends with no actual resolve.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Very good. That's, I think, all we're going to cover today. We're going to look into the next episode here in just a moment on why there's pain and suffering. We're going to talk about God's nature, and the fact that God actually suffered with us. So he does understand. So there's your summary of the next few episodes. So just skip it. You're good. Just kidding. Thank you for listening today to this podcast. Ethan, thank you for being with me today.
Most welcome. Thank you.
And we'll see you in the second part. Hey guys, thanks for listening to this episode of a Study in Truth podcast. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media or you can reach us at astudyintruth92 at gmail.com. And don't forget to rate our show.